Ernest Hemingway, the beloved author of books like A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and The Sun Also Rises, was 19 days shy of his 62nd birthday when he killed himself at his Ketchum home on July 2nd, 1961. Throughout his life, the author spent a lot of time in the gem state and even purchased property 2 years before his death. Today I'm speaking with Mark Cirino. He's the host of a podcast and multiple books about the late author. He'll tell us about the author's lifelong love affair with Idaho, what brought him to Idaho in the first place, and why he eventually decided to make the state his home. Mark, thanks for talking with me today.
Oh, it's a pleasure, Rhett. Happy to join you.
Let's get into this right off the bat. The titles, One True Podcast and your book, One True Sentence, that's referring to a statement that Ernest Hemingway once made. Do you want to explain that for people?
Sure. So in A Movable Feast, which is his memoirs about his time in Paris, he remembers being a young writer and I guess struggling with something that we might call writer's block. And he remembers that he used to encourage himself by saying that when things got tough, he said, all you have to do is write one true sentence, write the truest sentence that you know. So finally, I would write one true sentence and then go on from there. And since then, a century of writers have kind of used that as a credo. It's like, just find that one authentic sentence and then things will be able to, you can use that as inspiration. Things will go from there. So on our, obviously we took our title, One True Podcast, to honor that sentiment. But on that podcast, we also have kind of a game that we play with some of our guests where we ask them to choose one true sentence from all of Hemingway's writing and why. And so we built that little mini episodes around that concept. And we've had people like Elizabeth Strout and A. Scott Berg and Russell Banks and Sherman Alexie, many writers and scholars, and we asked them, what is your one true Hemingway sentence and why? And you'd be amazed at the incredible conversations that generates. So it's coming out in book form, and the book is also called One True Sentence. And that book will be out in July.
Okay, gotcha. You've got me curious now. With conversations that you have had with people about that, has there been one sentence that people have pointed to that's really stood out to you?
Well, the sentence that is the most popular is the last sentence in The Sun Also Rises, where the last sentence, and I'm going to hope this isn't a spoiler for any of your listeners, Rhett, it's when Jake says to Brett Ashley, Jake Barnes says to Brett Ashley, isn't it pretty to think so? And that's the last line of the novel. And so I think we had three different readers pick that sentence, and they all found something different that they responded to with that. The reason it's such a great concept is because you learn more about the reader than you do about Hemingway in a weird way. It's like a Rorschach test where you can, through all of Hemingway thing, what's the one sentence that you respond to? And in a weird way, that tells me your entrance into such a vast and complicated author. Rhett, now I'm regretting that I didn't ask you to prepare your one true sentence for our conversation. That's a missed opportunity.
Yeah, no kidding. Well, yeah, that's fascinating. I hope we get more into a conversation along those lines here in just a second. But as we mentioned, you are a professor and you teach classes about Ernest Hemingway along with the podcast and the book. And so you're kind of a pretty good authority on Ernest Hemingway and his life. How long have you been teaching about Hemingway now?
Probably since about 2000.
Oh, wow. So over 20 years. Yeah. When did your interest in Ernest Hemingway begin?
Well, I was sort of lucky that I grew up in a family of readers. So my father was always reading a newspaper and my mother was always reading a book. So everywhere you looked in my house, there were texts. And so it wasn't a great leap to just, as being a curious kid, go from bookshelf to bookshelf. And if I thought a cover looked interesting or a book title looked interesting, I would just pluck it out and start reading it and see what grabbed me. And for whatever reason, maybe I guess this was a little bit later, maybe late teens or early 20s, I really started reading Hemingway seriously. And I don't even know why I responded to Hemingway, because I'm not a hunter. I'm not a veteran. I'm not a drinker or a brawler. None of those things that we kind of associate with Hemingway. I think it was the language. I think I loved being in the world that Hemingway created and listening to his characters talk to one another. And I was hooked.
And I think it's interesting that I can't remember which one you said, but one of your parents was a journalist.
Yes,
and one of your parents was a reader, and that's perfect because that's exactly who Ernest Hemingway was.
That's exactly right.
So yeah,
that's exactly right.
So yeah, that's kind of fun. That worked out. What is it about Hemingway? You know, he died over 60 years ago now. In fact, last year was the 60th anniversary of his death. What is it, even 60 years later, that makes his work still stand out? He's kind of a literary classic.
Yes.
You know?
No, that's definitely true. And on one hand, the great thing about the classics that you're talking about, and it could be Fitzgerald or Faulkner or Hemingway or a visual artist like Van Gogh or Picasso, that if you're really great, you respond, you sort of evoke something universal, no matter what. It's not dependent on a locality or a specific period of time. You're eternal. So with Hemingway, I think he was relevant to the time, let's say post-World War I, but he also spoke to the more eternal concepts like courage and dignity and standing for something greater than yourself and love and death. So these are things that are going to be relevant. They were relevant 100 years ago, they're relevant now, and they will be relevant in 100 years. Now, that said, it is also true that we live in a different world in 2022 than 1922. So we have to react to Hemingway a little bit differently. We notice that some of his language doesn't fly these days. Some of his ideas seem a little bit obsolete, but that's okay. I don't think that means we shouldn't read him. It means that we're allowed to adapt Hemingway to our times and the world the way it is today. I think that's perfectly reasonable to do with art.
Well, and even, you know, if nothing else, it gives us a glimpse into what the thinking was at the time.
Yes.
And just makes us more informed and well-rounded on how the thought process has changed.
Exactly. Yeah, very good point.
So for our audience listening, we are based in Eastern Idaho. And, you know, so that covers Idaho Falls, Pocatello, but also portions of like farther west, like Sun Valley and Ketchum. And Ernest Hemingway had connections to that part of the state. In fact, he had a home in Ketchum later in his life. But for about 22 years, from about 1939 to the time of his death, he was traveling to Idaho a lot. It's a place he visited quite frequently. Do you know how how Idaho came up on his radar and why he was so enthralled with it?
Yeah. So my sense is he probably first learned about Idaho, you know, in sharper focus. I'm sure he was aware that there was a state named Idaho, but his friend in Paris was Ezra Pound, who's from Haley, Idaho. And so I'm sure that probably came into his consciousness at that point. Then in the 20s, Hemingway became really, really familiar with Wyoming. And for me, or I guess for me, the best way to describe it is that Hemingway's West, when we talk about Hemingway and the West, we're really talking about Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho. So how did he focus on Idaho specifically? As you mentioned, it was really 1939 when they were trying to build up Sun Valley as a commercial resort, they proposed to Hemingway that he stay there for free, and he could hunt for free, stay for free, and write and be on his own. The only thing he would need to do is lend his name to the facility. And that arrangement worked out for Hemingway. So in 1939, he went out with Martha Gellhorn, who would become his third wife, but was not at the time. And he fell in love with the place. In 1939, he was writing For Whom the Bell Tolls. And there probably was something about the topography of Idaho that evoked the land that he was writing about in the mountains of Spain. And so he really did fall in love with the place.
And did he actually end up finishing that book in Idaho?
That's a good question. Yes and no. In fact, he did. The reason I know that he finished that because he mailed it off to the publisher from Idaho. So yes, he did. I know that when he went out to Wyoming, he had 12 chapters done. And there were days where he was going so beautifully on the book that he would have to tell his hunting friends, I can't go out today. It's going too well. And I don't want to like lose that edge. So he would stay in and he would write. But a lot of times he would, as he often did in his life, he would find the perfect balance between outdoor activities, either hiking or going for walks, being out with people, hunting, and being by himself and writing. And he was when he had it right, he had the perfect balance between those things. He didn't have it right all the time, but he certainly did in 1939.
And I understand that before he bought a home there, before he bought property there was the lodge that he stayed in. He had the one designated room that was his. And even to this day, people who go and visit that lodge, it's known as the Hemingway Suite.
206.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Room 206. I've always wanted to go there. I look forward to being able to go there sometime. Yes. And it became, he fell in with a crowd of people who got him. They were not literary minded in the sense that, I mean, of course they appreciated what he did and they probably read his material, but they weren't gushing over him. He wanted to be treated like one of the guys. They always, the people that he hung around were always astounded at the kind of caricature of Hemingway that would later emerge as this sort of blustering, alcoholic, papa figure, you know, how that's often stereotyped. They're like, he was really down to earth and he was actually shy and quite pleasant. He was a great companion.
In all that Ernest Hemingway did throughout his life, I have never come across any reference that he ever made to Idaho in any writings or anything that he said. Are you aware of anything?
I do know that in For Whom the Bell Tolls, there's a moment in chapter 13 where Robert Jordan, the hero of For Whom the Bell Tolls, is thinking about when the Spanish Civil War is over and how life would be with his girlfriend, Maria. And then he says, maybe we'll be Mr. and Mrs. Robert Jordan from Sun Valley, Idaho. So he does name drop Sun Valley. He does name drop Sun Valley, Idaho.
But nothing as far as his thoughts about Idaho or...
No, not that I know of. No, yeah. Not that I know of. Although, when I did mention his first 12 chapters were in his pocket when he came out to Idaho in 1939, and then he references Sun Valley in chapter 13. You can get the sense that was like a a shout out.
I came across something on YouTube over the weekend. Somebody made a video. They were at the Hemingway property in Ketchum, and whoever the gentleman was that said it, he just made the comment that it's almost like Ernest Hemingway considered this place to be his personal haven. So he didn't want people to know about it. It was like the best kept secret. This is the place I go to find respite and even inspiration. It's a place that I love, and he wanted to almost maintain the privacy and the secrecy of it. Didn't want it to be known worldwide.
Yeah, I think so. In other words, that's why Sun Valley didn't become the locale of any of his stories or novels or anything along those lines. Yeah, when he wrote about, let's say, Pamplona in The Sun Also Rises in 1926, that when Jake Barnes and his friends go to the bullfights in Spain, that wasn't really a big international, it was a local festival. Of course, after it came out in The Sun Also Rises, and to this day, people make pilgrimages all over the world to go there. So it's become from a really quaint but boisterous local festival to this enormous international thing. So you can see why Hemingway would have wanted to keep, he was aware of the reach that his writing would have. So I think that sounds like a plausible explanation. He was when he went to Cuba, when he lived in Cuba, he was able to have relative peace and quiet until he didn't, until politics in Cuba would make that impossible, which is why he would spend his last few years in Ketchum.
As you know, Ketchum is also the place where he died. He died by suicide in July of 1961. Do you know much about the details of what happened the day of his death and how that kind of played out?
Well, so Hemingway was in and out of the Mayo Clinic and receiving shock therapy. He was having depressive episodes and almost schizophrenic episodes. And so the shock therapy was not helping. In fact, it was exacerbating the situation. So that Hemingway would drive through Idaho feeling paranoid. He felt like he was being watched. And his wife, Mary, so he and his wife, Mary, his fourth wife, were living in Ketchum. And Hemingway had access to his gun. And the night before the suicide, apparently he and his wife had a night together where Hemingway serenaded her with an old Italian folk song. They danced a little bit, went to bed, and then the next morning, July 2nd, Hemingway killed himself, it's where he's buried in Ketchum.
Yeah, okay. And he had been diagnosed with some type of mental illness. As you mentioned, he had been to the Mayo Clinic. What was his official diagnosis at the time?
So his doctor, George Saviors, who was also part of, that was his doctor in Idaho. They worked together to present Hemingway's situation and condition to the public. And they had it listed that he had high blood pressure, which he did, but they were very discreet about his psychological condition. Also, after his suicide, his widow, Mary, was also very protective of his legacy. They wanted to keep his dignity both in his last days and also in death. So it's only really in recent years. There's a recent book by a guy named Andrew Farah, who was a guest on our podcast, who wrote a book called Hemingway's Brain. And his thesis, and since he's a neurosurgeon, he would know a lot more than I would on this topic. His theory is that Hemingway had a kind of a version of CTE, the kind of concussive syndrome that boxers and football players have. Hemingway not only was wounded in World War I, but he had a history of accidents where he had a string of concussions. He would pull a skylight down onto his head, or he would fall on his boat and, you know, crack his head open. He had a couple of car accidents. He had 2 plane crashes in 1954. So Farah, among other people, are suggesting that he might have had this type of condition. One thing I will mention about his time in Idaho that I think goes along these lines is if you look at his photographs of Hemingway in 1939, he basically looks like a young movie star. He's slender, trimmed black mustache, black hair, vibrant. And then when he comes back after World War II, so he'll come back in 1946. So he's there for 39, comes for a few years, leaves for World War II, and he's spending a lot of time in Europe, but comes back in 1946. You would have thought he aged 20 years. And then when he comes back in the late 50s, you'd have thought he aged 50 years. It is shocking how precipitous his physical decline was. So he's got these mental and behavioral situations going on. He has physical ailments, and I'm sure his alcoholism didn't do him any favors either. But the precipitous decline is shocking. And all of that stuff is above my pay grade, Rhett. I want to let you know that, but that is my observation just from, just as a layperson.
And so here we are 60 years later, more than 60 years later after his death. There's a lot that I'm tempted to get into, but I don't want to get on a separate tangent here. But what is, from your opinion, what is Hemingway's literary legacy to the world? What has he left behind that is worthy of us continuing to study and to learn about and read about?
Yeah. So I know this is heresy to talk about William Faulkner during a Hemingway interview, but Faulkner in his Nobel Prize speech said that good writing deals with the eternal verities and truths of the human heart, which is to say things that will go on forever. It's like we were talking about with the classics. Hemingway's legacy is, so Hemingway influenced the generation of writers after him and sort of created such a seismic effect on the English language that it reverberates to this day. So readers can read a Hemingway novel or Hemingway short stories and learn about Hemingway's times, but also learn about their own psychology and emotion and consciousness. You can also, if you asked any writer, any fiction writer today, you would either find somebody who has been influenced by Hemingway or was influenced by somebody who was influenced by Hemingway. So it's really, Hemingway was one of the real turning points in literature in the early part of the 20th century. Let me say one other thing that is a specific. So one of Hemingway's most famous pronouncements about his own work is that he liked to compose on the Iceberg Principle. So as you know, an Iceberg Principle, the iceberg is 1/8 above water and all the rest is below. And so one of the things, if any of your listeners are going to read or reread Hemingway, one of the things that Hemingway is telling you is that most of the things that are being communicated in his work are not being stated explicitly. They're being suggested or implied. Now think of that, how complicated that makes things, right? That they're not being stated right out on the surface, but they're being suggested so that you have to participate in the meaning of the text.
Mm-hmm.
And that is really one of Hemingway's great contributions, is that notion of the text and the subtext. And I think we see that in a lot of different forms of art, not just literature, also music, visual arts, acting, this more modern sensibility of not putting everything out there, but actually putting just enough so that the reader, the watcher, the listener can participate in the artistic process.
Are there any authors today that you would put in the same category as Ernest Hemingway, the Hemingway of today?
One comes to mind, Cormac McCarthy, the author of All the Pretty Horses and The Road and No Country for Old Men. I think he does the same thing with language in terms of the power of the specifically chosen word. I think that he is examining the same themes, which are courage and humanity. He also writes beautifully about the landscape, although it's not as far north as you guys are. It's more, Texas and Mexico. Mm-hmm. But Cormac McCarthy, I think, is a very worthy inheritor of the Hemingway mantle. Now, McCarthy doesn't do very many interviews. In fact, he's only done one or two, but I bet I would really be interested to hear him talk about his Hemingway influence. We'd love to have him on One True Podcast if he decides to come around to give interviews. It
might have been you that said this. I don't know, or somebody that was on your podcast, but somewhere I heard somebody make a comment somewhere along the lines that if Mark Twain was the standard of the 19th century, Ernest Hemingway could arguably be the literary standard of the 20th century. Thoughts on that? Do you agree?
That's really interesting. So Hemingway really, one of his famous quotes is when he said, all modern American literature begins with one book, and that is Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. So that was Huckleberry Finn was 1884. And then, so I think that Hemingway, I would be hesitant to say that Hemingway is the defining writer of the 20th century. I think that he's in really good company with Fitzgerald and Steinbeck and Faulkner and Willa Cather. In terms of the early part of the 20th century, they all really, they all are part of a kind of a generation of writers that I think did all combined to write eternal works. So I would hesitate to say that Hemingway is stands apart from everybody in the 20th century.
Now, I failed to ask you this in the beginning. I should have began our discussion with this, but what is your favorite Hemingway work?
Well, I have kind of a disappointing answer for that. I hope it's not anticlimactic. I teach Hemingway and his books usually in rotation. I'll change it around just to keep things fresh. So I have found that my favorite book or short story is usually the next one that I'm about to teach.
Gotcha.
The next book I'm about to teach happens to be The Sun Also Rises. So that's the one I'm kind of enthusiastic for now. But once I'm done with that, I'll want to get on to the next one. My entry in Hemingway's career and work is really his Italian works. So all the short stories that he wrote about Italy, plus his two novels, A Farewell to Arms and Across the River and Into the Trees. I happen to really enjoy when Hemingway talks about Italy and writes about Italy and responds to it. So those are really, if I had to say favorite, I do love Hemingway and Italy.
Okay, gotcha. Well, Mark, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Again, I'll just mention the name of your podcast. It's called One True Podcast, which you can get anywhere you get podcasts. And then Your upcoming book in July is called One True Sentence, which I'm sure will be available on Amazon.
Absolutely.
Mark, thanks again. Anything else you would like to say about Ernest Hemingway's life or career?
So I think the only thing I would like to say is kind of what we were talking before about how you can read in a newspaper and Hemingway's name will come up. I was just watching the Supreme Court confirmation hearings and they mentioned Langston Hughes. So even if you think that a writer is in the dustbins of history, Langston Hughes wrote 100 years ago, what relevance could he have now? I always am thinking, as I'm reading, let's say I'm reading the newspaper, reading about Russia and Ukraine, what would Hemingway have to say about that? What would Hemingway as an intellectual or a political thinker have to say about that? What would his characters like Robert Jordan from For Whom the Bell Tolls have to say about that? John McCain was famously a huge fan of Ernest Hemingway, just as Barack Obama was. So it didn't really matter what side of the political spectrum you are, just that Hemingway has an insight into the times. And I think that will always be true.
I appreciate Mark Cirino taking some time with me today. Just to reiterate what I said in the beginning, he has a podcast. It's called One True Podcast, which you can find anywhere you get your podcasts. And then he has a book coming out in July called One True Sentence. That's available for pre-order right now on Amazon. Thanks for listening today. I'm Rhett Nelson with EastIdahoNews.com.